I was 19 rotations into my posting when the convoy appeared on long range. 3 ships, that was the whole of it. 3 ships moving on a shallow ecliptic out of the Korath drift. Engines at low burn, erratic in the way that frightened things go erratic. Not random exactly, but not efficient either. The kind of navigation that happens when the crew is alive and scared, and trying to be clever about it. Pulled the contact onto my secondary board and ran the standard classification sweep. The Ascendancy's taxonomy is old and thorough. By the time a hunter trainee reaches a forward post, the taxonomy is reflex. You look at a contact, and the category comes before the thought. 3 ships. Minimal power signatures. Thermal bloom consistent with civilian hull construction. The kind of pressed service transports that every species in the contested band had been pushing into service since the Ascendancy's expansion, reached their systems. 2 of them matching against known freight configurations. Wide body, low armament mount points, the hull geometry that cargo first and survival second. The 3rd ship, smaller, narrower, the drive signature that sat in the civilian-military overlap and didn't resolve cleanly. I flagged it for a second sweep and got the same result. Not a warship. Not a dedicated military hull. Something built for function rather than fighting, converted or repurposed, or simply old enough that its silhouette had blurred in the archive cross-reference. Category 9. Category 9 meant flight behavior. Category 9 meant prey that knew it was prey, that had been running long enough to develop the particular kind of desperation that makes contacts do things like take a shallow ecliptic through the Korath drift at reduced speed when any competent navigator would know the drift's long-range sensor shadow gave the Ascendancy 18 uninterrupted observation hours on anything that came through it. Category 9 meant the hunt was educational rather than challenging, something to close on slowly and let the junior hunters practice their approach geometry on. I filed the contact and tagged it for senior review. Master Cath pulled it inside the hour. 3 hulls, he said, the way he said everything, flat and certain, the voice of a predator who has never had cause to be uncertain. 2 Category 9 confirmed. 3rd needs a second look. I ran it twice, I said. It comes back civilian-military overlap. No clean match in the archive. No clean match, Vakath repeated. He studied the contact with the same flat attention he gave everything. Could be modified. Be a decommissioned patrol hull. Someone bolted extra plating onto. Happens at the edge of contested space. They use what they have. He flagged it Category 9 provisional. We'll see what it looks like up close. Command approved the exercise before the next watch cycle. 47 hunters dispatched. Live contact, Category 9 provisional training scenario. Close, assess, terminate. The humans in the contested band had been running for 8 months since the Ascendancy crossed the Dren boundary. Some of them ran well. The ones who ran well were useful. They taught the younger hunters how to close on a moving target with situational awareness, how to account for the small corrections and course changes that frightened prey made. The ones who ran badly taught the younger hunters almost nothing. The convoy in the Korath drift appeared to be somewhere in the middle. I wasn't assigned to the hunting group. I was at the forward sensor post. My job was to watch the board, log the approach geometry, pile the contact assessment for the archive. For a Category 9 exercise, this was routine. I had done it 11 times. You tracked the hunter's approach vectors. You watched the prey's evasion attempts. You noted the moment the prey's drive signatures spiked as they finally understood the closing geometry and pushed everything into a last sprint that never worked. You logged the termination times. You closed the file. The 47 hunters moved into position across the first 3 days. Standard spread pattern for a Category 9. Wide enough to prevent scatterbreak. Tight enough to apply pressure. Once contact was established, prey convoy maintained its shallow ecliptic, low burn, erratic course. 2 civilian hulls were easy to read on the board. Their thermal signatures had the irregular swell of emergency power management, short burns and longer coasts, the thermal profile of crew rationing fuel because they didn't know how much longer they'd need to run. The 3rd ship held its position relative to the other 2. It didn't lead the convoy. It didn't trail it. It sat between the other 2 ships and the approaching hunters, on the side where any contact would come first. I noticed that on day 2, it wasn't unusual, exactly. Even Category 9 prey sometimes showed protective behavior, putting whatever marginal fighting capacity they had between the threat and the non-combatants. It was behavior that never worked. It was documented behavior. I logged it and didn't think further about it until day 4, when I ran a fresh thermal sweep on the third ship and found something I couldn't immediately explain. The drive signature had changed. Not much. Not enough to trigger an automatic alert. But I was watching the board closely, the way you watch a board when there is nothing else to do. And 47 of the Ascendancy's finest hunters are 6 days from establishing contact with what should have been a training exercise. The third ship's thermal bloom had been running at the civilian-military overlap reading since first contact. Now it was lower. Not the low of a ship pushing hard on cold running, not the suppressed signature of a military hull in combat configuration, but low in a way that was difficult to categorize. A gradual reduction, consistent, as if something was actively drawing the ship's thermal signature down toward a target number. Military ships don't do that. Military ships in flight behavior run hot because they're pushing their drives hard to build separation distance. Civilian ships run hot because they're terrified and throwing everything into the engines. Ships that run progressively colder while being closed on by 47 hunters are ships that are doing something other than running. I filed a contact anomaly report at the end of day 4. Huntmaster Vakath reviewed it on day 5. He called it thermal drift from drive age variability. Older hulls sometimes bled heat in irregular patterns as components cycled through temperature ranges they weren't originally calibrated for. He confirmed the Category 9 provisional classification. He told me to note the anomaly in the archive and continue monitoring. I continued monitoring. On the morning of day 6, the third ship's drive signature dropped to near zero. This was not thermal drift. Near zero meant a ship running on minimal power, life support and passive sensors, nothing more. A ship in deep cold running. A ship that had decided, 6 days after 47 hunters began their approach geometry, to become as invisible as a hull its size could become. I had the anomaly flagged before the alert threshold registered, and I was staring at the contact marker for the third ship when I noticed a second thing. The 2 civilian hulls had not changed course. A convoy that loses its escort, loses the marginal fighting hull that had been positioning between the threat and the vulnerable ships, should react. It should scatter, or it should accelerate. It should do something that reflects the sudden removal of its best protection. The 2 civilian hulls were doing none of those things. They were holding the shallow ecliptic, low burn, the same erratic course drift they had maintained since the first day, as if they knew the third ship was still there. As if they knew exactly where it was, as if they had planned for this. I filed a second anomaly report, priority flag. I wrote it in plain language and I did not bury the conclusion. The third ship has gone to cold running with 47 hunters at 2 days intercept distance, and the civilian hulls are not responding as if their escort has been lost. Which means either the crew of those hulls does not know the third ship is running cold, or they know precisely where it is, and are maintaining the convoy's profile deliberately. First option means a critical failure in the convoy's coordination. The second option means something I do not have a category for. Vakath reviewed it in the next watch cycle. He called it an over-calibrated trainee seeing complexity in noise. He added a note to my file. He told me to log the contacts, not analyze them. I logged the contacts. For the rest of day 6 and through the night cycle, I watched the board with the kind of attentions that lives somewhere between professional obligation and a feeling I didn't have a name for yet. The 47 hunters were at intercept range by the following morning. Close enough that their sensor sweeps were painting the 2 civilian hulls in full resolution. The contact data coming back to my board was detailed now. I could see the hull configurations of the 2 civilian ships clearly. Wide body, battered, patches visible in the hull, plating at 3 locations on the lead ship, the thermal signature of a drive running on its last service interval. Category 9, absolutely Category 9, prey that had been running for a long time and was running out of ability to keep running. The third ship did not appear in any of the hunter's sensor returns. I ran that through the board twice to be certain. 47 hunters at intercept range, full active sensor sweeps, and the third ship was absent from every return. Not occluded by the civilian hulls, the geometry didn't support that, not a sensor error. 47 independent sweeps don't all fail on the same contact simultaneously. Absent, a ship that had been Category 9 provisional on my board for 6 days, that I had been watching reduce its thermal signature in a systematic progression towards zero, was now producing no sensor return at all. Stood up from my station. This is a thing that is not done at a forward sensor post during an active contact exercise. I stood up anyway, because there was no protocol in my training for what I was seeing, and I needed Vakath to understand that. Huntmaster. My voice came out, steadier than I expected. The third ship is sensor dark. Vakath looked at me the way he looked at everything. Hull contact lost, he said. Drive failure or scatter break. The civilian hulls are the contact now. 7 independent sweeps at intercept range. All lost the same contact simultaneously. That is not drive failure. Put the board readings on the main display. The third ship has been reducing its thermal signature since day 4 in a controlled, progressive manner. It is now producing no sensor return. It is running something that defeats active sweeps at close range. That is not a converted freight hull with marginal armament. That is enough. Vakath's voice had the quality of finality. The contact is logged Category 9 provisional. We have 47 hunters at intercept range and 2 confirmed Category 9 civilian hulls. The exercise proceeds. Where is the third ship? He didn't answer. He went back to his station. I went back to mine. I watched the board. The first hunter group reached the lead civilian hull at 0340 in the morning watch. The contact established cleanly. 3 hunters on a single target. The way a Category 9 is handled. Overwhelming force applied to a vessel with no realistic capacity to resist. The civilian hull's drive signature spiked hard in the first seconds. The thermal bloom of a ship that had just been told it had nowhere left to run. And then the spike flattened as the hull's crew made the calculation that most Category 9 prey makes eventually. The ship was still on my board. The hunters were still on my board. The exercise was proceeding exactly as the taxonomy predicted. The third ship's contact marker remained absent. CO347, the second civilian hull's contact registered the approach of the second hunter group. Same configuration. 4 hunters this time. Concession to the possibility that the second hull might make a harder run for it. The thermal signature spiked. The hull changed course by 11 degrees. A last-effort attempt at a scatterbreak, and was surrounded before the new heading had time to build any real separation. At 0349, Huntmaster Vakath said, "Contact." He meant a contact he hadn't been watching. Something had appeared on his board. I looked at my secondary display and saw what he was seeing, a sensor return, strong and sudden, appearing between the 2 civilian hulls and the third hunter group that was moving to support the exercise's conclusion. Not between, in the middle of, where there was nothing. The third ship had been running dark for 31 hours. When it powered up, it did so the way a large thing powers up when it has been waiting. Not a spike, not the thermal bloom of a frightened drive pushed to maximum output, but a steady, even rise in all signatures simultaneously. The drive, weapons systems, the active sensor emitters. Everything coming online in a sequence that was controlled and deliberate and spoke of a crew that had run through this procedure enough times to do it without haste. The hull's profile resolved on my board as the active sensors painted it in full resolution for the first time. It was not a converted freight hull. It was not a civilian military overlap contact. It was not Category 9 anything. The Gravthorn was 847 meters from bow to stern. The hull plating was mismatched. Older sections showing scorch marks and oxidation, newer repairs visible in the different sheen of replaced panels. But the mismatched plating was not the plating of a ship that had been patched, because it lacked resources. It was the plating of a ship that had been in combat multiple times and had been repaired because it kept surviving long enough to need repairs. The drive configuration was 4 wide aperture thrust columns arranged along a low slung spine, the geometry of a ship designed to deliver force on a flat attack plane, rather than maneuver above and below the ecliptic. The weapon systems that registered on the board as they came online were rail lance batteries. 6 of them, 3 to each lateral face, oriented in a spread pattern that put the third hunter group, the second hunter group, and the support elements of the first hunter group inside a simultaneous firing solution. 47 contacts. One ship, running dark for 6 days, positioned itself to hold 47 contacts inside a simultaneous firing solution. I had been at this post for 19 rotations. Had watched 11 Category 9 exercises conclude from this board. I had never filed a contact anomaly report that went to priority flag before, and when I did it, Vekath had added a note to my file. I was 19 rotations into my posting and 23 years old, and I understood, in the second and a half between the Gravthorn powering up and its first rail lance firing, what I had actually been watching for 6 days. Convoy had not been running. The convoy had been arriving. The first lance fired at SO 351. Rail lances at combat power produce a thermal bloom that registers on a sensor board as a solid white line. There is no gradation, no buildup, just the sudden presence of enormous force moving along a geometric line at a speed that makes interception a mathematical impossibility. First lance fired and the third hunter group's lead contact disappeared. Not damaged, not disabled. The contact was present, and then it was not present. Because the kinetic energy delivered to a hull, at that range, at that velocity, does not leave a hull. It leaves an expanding debris field. The sensor board classified it as debris and registered the new contact as background scatter inside 300 milliseconds. The last lancet fire poured before the board had finished updating from the first. Vekath was on the command channel. I could hear him speaking, not the flat, certain voice of a huntmaster running an exercise. The voice of someone running through options, faster than his training had prepared him for, and finding none of them adequate. Scatter brake order, full acceleration, break contact and build separation. Standard responses to a Category 9 contact that had revealed itself to be something other than Category 9. The 47 hunters were capable ships. They were not slow. Several of them had already begun the acceleration burn that a scatter brake order requires. The Gravthorn's rail lance batteries do not require a recalibration interval between firings. I know this because I watched the board for the next 11 minutes, and I counted. Not the hunter contacts disappearing. That was happening too fast to count in real time. The board updating and reclassifying, and the debris scatter accumulating until the sensor returns from 47 ships had been replaced by the sensor returns of an expanding debris field and the 3 civilian hulls maintaining their shallow ecliptic. I was counting the firing intervals. Time between Lance 1 and Lance 2. Time between Lance 2 and Lance 3. The intervals were consistent, not the intervals of a weapon system cycling under stress, not the intervals of a crew pushing a system beyond its rated output, but the intervals of a system operating within its design parameters, cycling at the rate it was built to cycle, firing as often as it was designed to fire. The Gravthorn had not been converted. It had not been repurposed. It was exactly what it had been built to be, operating exactly as its builders had intended, and the fact that nothing in the Ascendancy's archive had matched its hull configuration on the initial sweep was not a database gap or a misclassification. The Gravthorn was not in the archive because nothing that had previously encountered the Gravthorn had survived to file a contact. Port. At 0402, the 47th contact disappeared from the board. The board ran its standard post-engagement summary. T7, Ascendancy Hunter-class vessel, total crew complement of approximately 900. 0 survivors logged. The Gravthorn's hull showed no damage. No thermal signature consistent with incoming fire. No structural irregularities. No change in drive output. The 6-day cold run had not taxed its systems. The 11 minutes of sustained rail lance fire at full combat power had not taxed its systems. The Gravthorn sat between the 2 civilian hulls the way it had been sitting since the first day. Except that now it was no longer running dark, and the board showed it clearly. 847 meters, mismatched hull plating, 4 wide aperture thrust columns, 6 lateral rail lance batteries, all of them rotating back through their post-firing cycle to ready configuration. The civilian hulls resumed their course. Not a scatter break, not an emergency sprint for distance. The shallow ecliptic, low burn, the same erratic course drift they had been maintaining since the Korath drift. as if nothing had happened. As if this was what the passage through the drift had always been scheduled to look like, and the 47 hunters had been the variable that the schedule had accounted for and resolved. I sat at my board for a long time after that. Vikath was filing his report. I could see the activity on the command channel, the back and forth of a senior officer trying to explain a contact outcome that the standard taxonomy had no category for. There would be a review. There would be an analysis of my anomaly reports and the notes in my file, and the question of whether the Category 9 provisional classification should have been escalated. There would be a great deal of activity designed to determine how 47 hunters had been sent to conduct a training exercise and had instead participated in the demonstration of something that the Ascendancy had not been told existed. I ran the contact file from the beginning. The first detection in the Korath drift, the thermal signatures, the initial classification sweep, the progressive cold run, the 6 days of approach geometry. I ran it through the archive cross-reference one more time, looking for anything that matched the Gravthorn's hull profile, its drive configuration, its weapons specifications. The archive returned no matches. That was not a database gap. That was not a misclassification. That was a species that had been in the Ascendancy's contested band for 8 months, running according to every contact we had made with their vessels, that had built something the archive had never seen and sent it into the drift in a configuration designed to look like everything the archive predicted. Category 9 prey would look like, and run it dark for 6 days, while 47 of our finest hunters counted down to an exercise they believed they had already won. I thought about the 2 civilian hulls, the wide-body freighters, with the patched plating and the irregular drive signatures, the ones that had held the shallow ecliptic without change when the Gravthorn powered down to near zero, the ones that had never scattered or surged, or done any of the things that prey did when it lost its protection. I thought about the crews on those ships, the humans who had sat in those hulls for 6 days while 47 hunters closed in, knowing where the Gravthorn was, knowing what it was doing, trusting the trajectory and the plan and the patience of a crew running cold in the dark while the hunters came on. I thought about what it would take to trust that, to sit in a wide-body freighter with patched plating and an emergency drive interval and Category 9 contact flags all over you, with 47 of the Ascendancy's finest hunters at 2 days intercept distance, and hold your course, hold your speed, hold the erratic drift pattern that said, I am prey and I am running and I do not know where you are. To do that for 6 days and not break, not surge, not do the thing that a frightened crew in a civilian hull does when it finally understands the closing geometry. 2 civilian hulls had never been frightened. Or if they had been frightened and they were biological, and biological things with survival instincts are frightened in situations like that one, it is not possible for them not to be. They had held the plan anyway. They had held it for 6 days, every hour of a closing approach that every survival instinct they had must have been screaming to run from, because the plan required them to be there, to look like prey, to be the thing that 47 hunters were counting on being where they expected prey to be. The Gravthorn had needed 6 days to get into position. The civilian hulls had held for 6 days to give it those days. I saved the contact file. I flagged it for archive review. I added a notation that the Category 9 classification taxonomy should be reviewed in light of this contact outcome, and that the contact anomaly reports filed on days 4, 5, and 6 of the approach had FI'd the relevant data, and that the command decision to proceed with the exercise against provisional classification without resolving the anomalies should be included in the review. Then I looked at the board one more time. The 3 ships were still on it. The Gravthorn's drive signature had settled back to something in the civilian-military overlap range, not the near zero of the cold run, not the full combat power of the engagement, something in the middle, the signature of a ship moving at cruise speed with its systems at standard readiness. It was not hiding now. It was not running dark. Just moving the way ships move when they are going somewhere, and they are not in any particular hurry because they do not need to be in a hurry, because the thing that was between them and where they were going is no longer on the board. 900 hunters. That was the total crew complement of 47 Hunter-class vessels. 900 of the Ascendancy's trained, experienced hunters, sent to conduct a Category 9 exercise against 3 ships in the Korath Drift. 11 minutes. The Gravthorn's drive signature continued its steady cruise. The board was quiet. The Korath Drift's long-range sensors painted the debris field, expanding along the trajectory the 47 hunters had been following. When the rail lance batteries caught them, the scattered remnants of 94 hull sections in a spread pattern that traced the geometry of the trap as clearly as a diagram. The trap that had been 6 days in the making. The trap that had begun the moment we put the first contact flag on a 3-ship convoy and read it as Category 9 prey. We had been right about the 3 ships. We had been exactly right about what we were looking at. We had just been looking at it from the wrong direction. I filed my contact report. I wrote it carefully, in the same plain language I had used for the anomaly reports, without hedging, and without the kind of institutional qualification that made difficult reports easier to receive. I wrote what I had seen. I wrote what the board had shown me. I wrote the firing intervals I had counted, and the 6-day thermal progression I had logged, and the fact that the 2 civilian hulls had not responded when the Gravthorn went to near zero because they had known where it was, and I wrote the conclusion plainly. The contact designated Category 9 provisional on day 1 of this approach was not Category 9. It was Category 1. It had been Category 1 since before we detected it. The convoy configuration, the civilian hull profiles, the erratic course drift, the low burn signatures. These were not flight behavior. They were the approach behavior of a hunting species that had spent 6 days doing to 47 of our hunters exactly what 47 of our hunters had believed they were doing to it. The last line of my report: there are no sensor returns from the 47 dispatched units. The Gravthorn is on course, cruise speed, drive signature nominal. It is not in the archive. Based on this contact, I recommend we determine how many more like it exist before we send another exercise group. I submitted the report and watched the board. The 3 ships moved through the drift on a steady heading, unhurried, the way things move when they know where they are going. The Gravthorn's drive signature was warm in the civilian-military overlap range. Nothing the taxonomy would have flagged. Nothing that would have caught a sensor post its attention first contact if you didn't know what to look. I knew what to look for now. I watched until the 3 ships reached the far edge of the drift's sensor shadow and crossed out of range. The board cleared the contacts once by one, debris field and all, until the Korath Drift was empty. Then I sat in the silence of the forward post and understood for the first time that the species in the contested band had not been running for 8 months. They had been learning how we hunt.